In the quiet beauty of Lake Tahoe, a former Major League pitcher's life took a dark turn. What began as a family loan turned into a tale of betrayal and murder. Behind the calm surface of mountains, detectives uncovered a story that stunned an entire community. The quiet community around Lake Tahoe, California, is known for its calm blue water, forest trails, and peaceful small towns tucked between the mountains. It's the kind of place where people wave at each other on the road and leave their doors unlocked. That sense of safety was shattered one summer morning in 2021 when police responded to a shocking scene inside a home in Homewood, on the west shore of Lake Tahoe. A 70-year-old man named Robert Gary Spar was found shot to death. His wife, 68-year-old Wendy Wood, had also been shot but was still alive, bleeding and disoriented. Their two small grandchildren were in the house at the time, too young to understand what had just happened, but old enough to feel something terrible had occurred. At first, investigators had little to go on. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious robbery, and no suspects. But behind that quiet family home was a history of resentment, financial conflict, and betrayal that would slowly come into focus. The man who would eventually be accused and convicted of orchestrating the attack was someone close to the victims. Their son-in-law, 51-year-old Dan Serafini. Dan Serafini wasn't a stranger to the spotlight. He had once pitched in Major League Baseball, wearing uniforms for teams like the Minnesota Twins, Chicago Cubs, and Cincinnati Reds in the 1990s and early 2000s. After his professional sports career ended, he drifted between business ventures, some successful, others not. By 2021, he had settled in the Lake Tahoe area with his wife, Erin Spar, and their two children. Together, they owned and operated a local gym called Tahoe Fit, where Dan also offered baseball training for kids. On the surface, they seemed like a normal family making a life after sports. But privately, financial trouble and personal frustrations were building to a breaking point. Erin's parents, Robert and Wendy, were well off and deeply involved in their daughter's life. They had lent or invested more than $1 million, about $1.3 million, according to court records, into Erin's business projects. Much of that money went toward the gym and property improvements. But over time, the relationship between Dan and his in-laws became tense. Robert and Wendy wanted accountability for the money they had given. They questioned how it was being used and demanded repayment. Dan, proud and struggling to keep his ventures afloat, saw their questions as interference and humiliation. In private messages later revealed in court, Serafini's tone toward his in-laws grew darker. He felt they looked down on him, that they didn't respect his efforts or his ability to provide. The more financial pressure he faced, the more bitterness took root. Prosecutors would later describe it as a mix of resentment and greed, an anger that had been simmering for years before it finally exploded. Meanwhile, someone else had entered their lives, a woman named Samantha Scott. In her mid-30s, Scott had worked as the family's nanny and was a close friend of Erin's. She spent time around the children, the gym, and even the Spar home. Over time, her relationship with Dan became more personal. After Erin and Dan separated, Scott remained in touch with him and often visited his home. She became both his confidant and later his accomplice. In early 2021, as the COVID-19 pandemic dragged into its second year, the gym was struggling. Membership numbers were down and financial strain deepened. Serafini confided in Scott about his frustrations with the Spars. He told her he felt betrayed and trapped by the debt he owed them. According to prosecutors, this is when his thoughts began to turn deadly. He started talking about wanting his in-laws gone, and made statements like, "I'm going to kill them one day." It wasn't just anger, it was planning disguised as venting. By spring, those dark ideas were turning into action. Serafini allegedly asked Scott to help him carry out the plan. She later told investigators that she agreed to drive him, though she claimed she didn't believe he would actually go through with it. They began preparing in secret, buying supplies, discussing timing, and even testing a homemade silencer. The plan was to strike at Robert and Wendy's home when they were alone. On June 5, 2021, the plan was put in motion. Just after dawn, a figure dressed in dark clothing appeared on the security camera outside the spa residence. The person moved carefully, avoiding open spaces, wearing a hood and face covering. Hours passed before the next camera showed movement again. By then, the attack had already happened. Inside, Wendy later told investigators she had been getting ready for the day when a masked man entered their home. He carried a gun. Shots were fired. Robert was struck and killed instantly. Wendy was hit, but somehow survived long enough to call 911. When deputies arrived, they found her barely conscious, but alive. She was rushed to the hospital, where she spent weeks recovering. Her account was limited and confused. She didn't know who the shooter was or why it had happened. The scene left investigators puzzled. There was no sign of theft or forced entry. The couple's wallets, jewelry, and valuables were untouched. Whoever had done it came for one reason only: to kill. Detectives began piecing together timelines, checking phone records, and reviewing the home's security footage frame by frame. What they found was a faint outline of a vehicle seen near the house hours before the attack, a car later linked to someone close to Serafini. Over the following months, detectives kept digging. They interviewed family members, business associates, and friends. Erin, Dan's wife, was devastated and shocked. She insisted she had no idea who could have done this. Her mother, Wendy, remained traumatized, battling both physical pain and deep emotional scars. Though she survived, she was never the same again. The case grew cold for a time. Leads came and went, but none led directly to Serafini. He kept living in the Tahoe area, coaching kids and posting about family life on social media. To outsiders, he seemed to be moving on. But privately, investigators were building a timeline. They had discovered that Serafini and Samantha Scott had traveled together on multiple occasions, including near the time of the shooting. GPS data, security footage, and cell tower pings began to line up in ways that were hard to ignore. What made the investigation difficult was the lack of a clear confession or witness. The attack had been carefully planned and executed. No one saw Serafini at the scene. But forensic experts continued to analyze small traces, DNA from shell casings, fibers, and the vehicle connected to Scott. Slowly, a clearer picture emerged. Two people, both close to the victims, working together out of shared anger and misplaced loyalty. For Wendy, recovery was slow and painful. She tried to rebuild her life after losing her husband in such a brutal way. Family members described her as heartbroken but determined to see justice done. Still, the trauma lingered. The home that had once been a place of safety now held memories she couldn't escape. She eventually moved away from Tahoe, trying to heal, but her grief never faded. As the investigation continued quietly in the background, life appeared to go on for Serafini. But behind the scenes, detectives were closing in. They traced purchases of ammunition, surveillance of the Spar home, and communications between Serafini and Scott that hinted at something sinister. Every piece of data told the same story. The crime was not random, it was calculated, driven by resentment and greed. By late 2022, police had built enough circumstantial evidence to believe they were looking at a murder-for-hire plan that had failed to fully erase its tracks. They began coordinating with multiple agencies, including the Placer County Sheriff's Office and the Nevada authorities, to gather everything needed for an arrest. The pieces were almost in place, but they still lacked one key element: a cooperating witness who could explain exactly how it happened. That moment was still to come. For now, the public knew little. The case remained unsolved officially, but investigators believed it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Beneath the calm surface of Lake Tahoe, a story of betrayal, anger, and family tragedy was waiting to break open. After the shooting at the Spar home, investigators worked quietly but steadily. Months went by, and the case seemed to go cold on the surface, but detectives never stopped searching. The lack of forced entry, the clean execution, and the absence of theft told them one thing: the killer knew the victims. They began looking closer at people in the couple circle, especially family members and anyone who had access to the home. That led them toward Daniel Serafini, the 51-year-old former Major League Baseball pitcher and son-in-law of Robert and Wendy. At first, nothing directly linked Serafini to the crime. He had an alibi and appeared calm whenever questioned. But detectives found his financial situation troubling. He and his wife Erin had received over $1 million from her parents to fund their gym business, Tahoe Fit, and to help with property investments. Robert and Wendy had treated it as a loan, not a gift, and by 2021 they were asking for repayment. Dan, who had been struggling financially, grew bitter. He felt his in-laws had turned against him and blamed them for his problems. Witnesses later said he often spoke resentfully about them, describing Robert as controlling and Wendy as judgmental. As the months passed, detectives reviewed hours of footage from security cameras in the Homewood neighborhood. They noticed a hooded figure walking near the Spar home around 3 a.m. on the morning of June 5, 2021. The person moved with confidence, not like a stranger. A silver SUV appeared on camera a few streets away at nearly the same time. The vehicle was later traced to a woman named Samantha Scott, who had once worked for the family as a nanny and had become close to Dan after he separated from Erin. This discovery changed the direction of the case. Scott, in her mid-30s, was well known to the family. She had lived with the Serafinis for a time and was considered trustworthy. After Dan and Erin's marriage fell apart, Scott stayed in touch with Dan and often helped with his kids. She was loyal, devoted, and, as it would turn out, willing to do almost anything for him. Detectives started piecing together her movements around the time of the murder. They found evidence that she and Dan had traveled together to the Tahoe area that week. GPS records from her phone showed she was near the Spar house early that morning. The discovery of Scott's connection to the crime scene gave detectives the first solid lead in over a year. They started re-examining both of their phone records and financial transactions. It turned out that in the weeks leading up to the murders, Scott had purchased several items online, including a gun part and materials that could be used to make a silencer. One of those items matched the type used in the Spar shooting. Investigators also found text messages between Scott and Serafini that hinted at planning, discussions about timing, travel, and getting it done. By 2023, the sheriff's office had built a strong circumstantial case. They believed Serafini had orchestrated the attack and that Scott had helped him carry it out. In October 2023, more than 2 years after the shootings, police arrested both of them. Serafini was taken into custody in Nevada, where he had been living. Scott was arrested in Las Vegas. Their arrests made national headlines. News outlets everywhere reported that a former MLB player had been accused of murdering his in-laws. At the time of the arrests, both Serafini and Scott denied any involvement. They claimed they had nothing to do with the crime. But the evidence was mounting. Phone data, travel logs, and financial motives were hard to ignore. During searches of Serafini's home, investigators found more indications of planning. Internet searches related to silencers, firearms, and even questions about how long fingerprints last on shell casings. The emotional weight of the case grew heavier in 2023 when Wendy Wood, who had survived the attack, died by suicide. Her family said she had never recovered from losing her husband or from her injuries. She had lived in fear since the shooting, unable to sleep through the night. Her death, though separate from the original crime, deepened the tragedy and became part of the story the prosecution would later tell in court. A family destroyed by greed and resentment. In early 2025, Samantha Scott broke. Facing the possibility of spending her life in prison, she decided to cooperate with prosecutors. She agreed to plead guilty to being an accessory to murder and to testify against Serafini. Her testimony was detailed and devastating. She told investigators that Serafini had been talking about killing his in-laws for months. He was angry about the $1.3 million loan and believed Robert and Wendy were trying to take everything from him. She said he described them as the problem and that he couldn't move forward until they were gone. Scott admitted she had helped him plan the attack. She said they drove to the Tahoe area the day before the murders, parked a distance away, and waited until early morning. Serafini, she said, wore dark clothing and carried a backpack with a gun inside. She dropped him near the Spar home and waited in the car. Hours later, he came back pale and quiet. He told her it was done. They drove off without speaking much. When news of the shooting broke, she realized what he had done, but was too afraid to come forward. Her confession filled in the final missing pieces. Cell phone records confirmed their locations matched her account. The security footage aligned with the timing she described. The digital trail, her testimony, and the forensic evidence together created a complete narrative for prosecutors. They now had both motive and method, a man driven by resentment and a loyal companion who helped him carry out his revenge. As the trial approached, Serafini's defense team argued that Scott was lying to protect herself. They said she acted alone or was manipulated by investigators into blaming him. They tried to present Serafini as a family man under financial stress, not a murderer. But the evidence was overwhelming. Scott's story fit the physical proof, and her testimony painted a chilling picture of planning and intent. By the time the jury was seated in 2025, the case had drawn national attention. The story of a former professional athlete accused of killing his wealthy in-laws captivated the public. Reporters filled the courtroom, waiting for every new piece of testimony. Over several weeks, prosecutors presented their timeline, the financial disputes, the threats, the drive to Tahoe, and the attack itself. Each fact pushed the story toward an inevitable conclusion. The evidence showed how greed and pride can twist a man's mind until he crosses a line he can never return from. The victims were people who had once tried to help, only to be betrayed by the very person they had supported. As closing arguments neared, the courtroom grew tense. The fate of Daniel Serafini, former MLB pitcher, husband, father, and now accused murderer, was about to be decided. By the time the trial began in the summer of 2025, the courtroom in Auburn, California, was packed every day. Reporters, locals, and even some of Serafini's old baseball fans filled the seats to witness how the story would end. The defendant, once known as an MLB pitcher with a calm, confident presence, now sat silent at the defense table, eyes fixed on the floor. Across from him, prosecutors laid out a case built on years of quiet investigation, hard evidence, and the voice of the woman who had helped him do it, Samantha Scott. The prosecution began by walking the jury through the timeline one more time. They showed how the money from Robert and Wendy had started as a helping hand, but had become a source of resentment. They presented records of the $1.3 million loan, Aaron's parents' repeated attempts to get it repaid, and Serafini's growing frustration as his business struggled. They played recordings of his messages to friends, where he said he hated his in-laws and that they deserved to be gone. Every detail pointed to the same motive: anger, humiliation, and greed. Samantha Scott's testimony was the centerpiece. She took the stand and spoke in a calm but nervous voice, recounting how her friendship with Serafini had turned into something dangerous. She described him as charming but controlling, a man who could make people feel like they owed him loyalty. She told the jury about the nights they spent planning, the list he made, the talk about silencing witnesses and making it clean. Her voice trembled when she said she drove him to the Spar home that morning and waited in the car. She remembered him returning hours later, pale and shaken. "It's done," he said. That was all. Defense attorneys tried to discredit her, painting her as a liar who had made up the story to save herself. They pointed out that there was no direct video of Serafini pulling the trigger, no eyewitness inside the house. They argued that the state's case rested too heavily on Scott's word and on digital evidence that could be misinterpreted. But the prosecutors had more than her testimony. They had phone data showing both Serafini's and Scott's devices near the scene, surveillance video of Scott's car, receipts for the items used in the crime, and the threat Serafini had sent in the months before. Wendy's recorded statements from 2021 were also played for the jury. Though she had passed away 2 years later, her words lived on in the interviews she gave police after the shooting. Her soft, shaking voice described waking up to a man in her home, hearing the gunshots, and realizing Robert was gone. The courtroom grew still as those recordings played. Everyone could feel the weight of her pain, the horror of what had been done to her family. The prosecution's closing argument was clear and steady. They said Serafini had every reason to want his in-laws dead and every opportunity to make it happen. He had money problems, a history of resentment, and a partner willing to help. They described the crime as deliberate and cold, the act of a man who thought he could plan his way out of failure. They asked the jury to hold him accountable not just for murder, but for the betrayal of the people who had once trusted him most. The defense made one last attempt to sway the jury, reminding them that Scott had cut a deal and that her testimony might be self-serving. They asked jurors to question whether she might have been the one behind the attack, using Serafini's anger as a cover. But the jury had already seen too much. The evidence, the timing, and the planning all pointed in one direction. After 6 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the verdict was read aloud. Daniel Serafini was found guilty of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and burglary. The courtroom was silent except for the faint sobbing of Erin, who sat in the back, caught between grief for her parents and disbelief at what her husband had done. Serafini showed no emotion as the words were spoken. His eyes stayed fixed on the table, his face unreadable. At sentencing, the judge spoke directly to him. He said the crime was cruel, calculated, and fueled by greed. He noted that Serafini had turned on the very people who had supported him and caused a chain of pain that would last generations. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Scott, because of her cooperation and plea deal, received a reduced sentence as an accessory and would serve several years in prison. As reporters gathered outside the courthouse, the community reflected on how such a tragedy could have happened. Neighbors who once saw Serafini coaching children's baseball could barely reconcile that image with the one described in court. Erin, now raising her children alone, released a short statement through her attorney. She said she was grateful for justice, but deeply saddened for everyone involved. "My parents gave everything to help us," she said. "Their generosity cost them their lives." In the months that followed, the case of Daniel Serafini became another reminder of how easily resentment can turn into violence. It wasn't a story of strangers or random danger. It was a story of a family destroyed from within. What began as a loan meant to support a business ended as a motive for murder. For the people of Lake Tahoe, it left a scar on a community that had long seen itself as safe and peaceful. The story reached its end not with a twist, but with the quiet realization that the truth had been there all along. The tension, the financial strain, the anger, it had all been visible to those around them, just never believed capable of turning deadly. For the investigators who spent years untangling the evidence, justice came slowly but completely. For the surviving family, closure would remain elusive. The house in Homewood stood empty for months after trial, a silent reminder of how greed and pride can destroy even the most ordinary of lives. In a quiet Corona neighborhood, a former baseball prodigy, once bound for the major leagues, turned his family home into a crime scene. What drove Brandon Martin from first-round draft pick to triple murder? This is the chilling story of success, madness, and the night everything shattered. It began like a story that should have gone another way. Brandon Willie Martin grew up in Corona, California, a town about 50 miles southeast of Los Angeles. To his family, he was more than a promising athlete. He was the kid who made it out, who turned his baseball talent into a ticket to something bigger. Brandon, in his early 20s by 2015, had been a shortstop with a bright future. In 2011, the Tampa Bay Rays drafted him in the first round, 38th overall. Scouts said he was fast, skilled, and confident. But the story of his rise would never match the story of his fall. At home, things were changing fast. His father, Michael Martin, was in his 60s, a patient man who had supported Brandon's career from the beginning. His uncle, Ricky Lee Anderson, was in his late 50s, known as a steady presence who often tried to keep peace in the family. Both men lived nearby, often checking in on Brandon and his mother, Kathy. The third man who would become part of this tragedy, Barry Swanson, was a 62-year-old technician for ADT Security Services, a man with no connection to the Martins, except that he'd been sent to their home to help install a new alarm system. By 2015, Brandon's life had veered off course. The Tampa Bay Rays had released him earlier that year after several injuries and behavioral problems. Those close to him saw changes that went far beyond disappointment. He had become increasingly paranoid, suspicious of his own family, and convinced that people were watching him. His behavior grew violent. At one point, he smashed a television during an argument with his father. He stopped trusting friends and isolated himself. Family members began calling police for help, hoping someone could step in before things got worse. In mid-September 2015, the situation reached a breaking point. On September 15th, Brandon was taken by Riverside County deputies and placed on a 72-hour mental health hold under California's Welfare and Institutions Code 5150, which allows temporary detention for evaluation when someone is considered a danger to themselves or others. He had allegedly threatened his parents and damaged property inside their home. The family hoped this would be the wake-up call he needed. But only a day later, Brandon was released. Doctors determined he did not meet the criteria to keep him hospitalized. His parents were told he was free to return home. When he came back to Corona, tension filled the house. Michael and Kathy, terrified of another outburst, called ADT to install a new security system. They wanted cameras, locks, alarms, anything that could give them a sense of safety. On September 17th, ADT sent Barry Swanson to do the job. He was an older man, gentle and polite, known among co-workers as dependable. That day, while Swanson worked, Michael and Ricky were at the house too. They were trying to keep an eye on Brandon, who seemed calmer than before. No one could know what he was planning. Neighbors later said the day had been quiet until the evening. Sometime before sunset, Brandon picked up a black wooden baseball bat, the same kind he once used in his minor league days. It was engraved with his name. The next moments turned that familiar object into a weapon. Inside the home, Brandon attacked Barry Swanson first, striking him repeatedly until he collapsed. Then he turned on his father, Michael, beating him with the same force. When his uncle Ricky tried to intervene, Brandon hit him too. The scene was violent, quick, and final. Michael and Barry died at the house. Ricky was still breathing when help arrived, but his injuries were devastating. He would die 2 days later in the hospital. The crime scene told its own story. There were signs of struggle, blood across the living room, and the bat left near one of the bodies. Brandon didn't stay long. After the attack, he took Swanson's white Ford Raptor pickup truck and fled. He drove away from the neighborhood, heading north out of Corona as police began responding to 911 calls. One of the first calls came from a relative who had stopped by the house and found the bodies. The voice on the recording was panicked, barely able to explain what had happened. Officers arrived within minutes, but by then Brandon was already gone. By nightfall, a manhunt began. Corona Police, the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, and California Highway Patrol units joined forces, broadcasting alerts with Brandon's name, description, and the license plate of the stolen truck. He was considered armed and dangerous. Helicopters circled parts of Riverside County through the night, searching roads and fields. Meanwhile, detectives worked inside the house, collecting evidence, fingerprints, blood samples, the engraved bat that tied everything directly to Brandon. While investigators searched, the community struggled to understand. Neighbors described Michael as a devoted father, always proud of his son. One woman who lived nearby said she used to see Brandon practicing in the yard as a teenager, hitting balls over the fence. Others said he'd seemed troubled lately, wandering around late at night, staring at passing cars. Rumors spread quickly. Some thought he was on drugs. Others said he'd been hearing voices. The truth was more complicated, a mix of mental illness, frustration, and anger that no one had been able to contain. Early the next morning, on September 18th, police spotted the stolen truck in Norco, just a few miles from the Martin home. When officers tried to pull him over, Brandon refused to stop. The chase was short but tense. He drove recklessly through residential streets before crashing the vehicle and running on foot. He broke into a nearby house where the residents were away and tried to hide upstairs. Officers surrounded the area and brought in a K-9 unit. When they entered the house, they found him cornered on the second floor. In one desperate move, Brandon jumped out of a window, landing hard on the ground below. He tried to keep running, but was quickly caught by the police dog and tackled by officers. The arrest was rough but swift. He resisted briefly before being handcuffed. Officers described him as expressionless, quiet, almost detached. When they searched him, they found nothing unusual. No weapon, no drugs, just a man covered in scratches and bruises from the fall. Back at the crime scene, investigators continued piecing together what had led to the killings. They confirmed the sequence of victims and gathered autopsy results. Michael had suffered fatal blunt force trauma to the head. Barry Swanson's injuries were similar. Ricky had sustained skull fractures and internal bleeding. The bat marks were distinctive, each matching the engraved letters of Brandon's name found on the weapon. In the hours that followed, word spread through Corona and beyond. The media picked up the story quickly. Former MLB prospect arrested in triple murder. It sounded almost unreal, like a headline from a movie. But for those who knew the Martins, it was heartbreakingly real. A father, a brother, and an innocent worker had lost their lives. A son had destroyed his own family. Police soon confirmed that Brandon had acted alone. There was no evidence of outside involvement or premeditated robbery. The motive seemed personal. Anger and paranoia directed at the people closest to him. His mother, Kathy, who had not been home during the attack, was placed under protective watch. She told investigators she'd been afraid something like this might happen, but she had never imagined it could reach this level. As the first day ended, the timeline became clear. A young man once celebrated for his talent had turned his own home into a crime scene. The 22-year-old who once dreamed of the major leagues was now sitting in a county jail, silent, under suicide watch. 3 lives were gone, a community was in shock, and the promise that had once surrounded the Martin name had vanished. In the days after the killings, the once quiet neighborhood in Corona turned into a constant swirl of flashing lights, yellow tape, and reporters. Neighbors stood behind fences, whispering about what had happened to the Martin family. Police guarded the house as forensic teams worked around the clock. Inside, the evidence spoke clearly: blood on the walls, shattered glass, and the baseball bat with Brandon's name burned into the wood. It was a grim reminder of how fast a family home had turned into a crime scene. Brandon Martin was taken into custody at the Riverside County Jail, where he remained under observation. Investigators immediately began interviewing witnesses and collecting every piece of his recent history: his behavior before the murders, his mental health evaluations, and his interactions with law enforcement in the days leading up to the attack. Detectives learned that his parents had made several calls to the police earlier in the week, pleading for help. Michael had told officers that his son had become violent and unpredictable. When deputies finally detained Brandon on September 15th, they believed he needed medical help, not jail time. Doctors at the behavioral health facility confirmed that Brandon had shown signs of paranoia, but concluded he wasn't an immediate danger to others. They released him within a day. That decision would later become one of the most heavily questioned moments in the entire case. 2 days later, 3 men were dead. As the investigation expanded, police traced Brandon's movements after his release. They found surveillance footage showing him walking through the neighborhood the evening before the killings, appearing calm but detached. He visited a friend briefly, said little, and left before dark. Witnesses recalled that he seemed distracted, like someone lost in his own world. At the Martin house, Barry Swanson had arrived around 6 p.m. to finish the security system installation. He was talking with Michael and Ricky in the living room when Brandon came in. No one knows what words were exchanged, but investigators believe a confrontation broke out soon after. Brandon may have seen the ADT technician's presence as a sign that his family was trying to lock him out. Whether it was anger or delusion that pushed him over the edge, it only took seconds for everything to collapse. As police pieced together the evidence, they also began mapping Brandon's mental history. Records from his time in the Tampa Bay Rays organization showed early signs of behavioral trouble. Coaches had reported mood swings and defiance. He'd been suspended more than once for fighting with teammates and arguing with managers. After leaving the team in 2015, he returned to Corona, where his decline became rapid. Detectives searched his bedroom after the murders. They found old baseball gear, letters from coaches, and notebooks filled with odd scribbles, random words, names, and short phrases written repeatedly. Nothing pointed directly to a motive, but everything suggested a man losing touch with reality. Meanwhile, the autopsies confirmed the brutality of the attack. Each victim had suffered multiple blows to the head and face. The injuries were consistent with a wooden bat swung at full strength. Investigators said the attack was so severe it was clear Brandon intended to kill. There were no signs of defensive wounds on him, meaning none of the men had fought back long. Prosecutors began building their case almost immediately. They charged Brandon with 3 counts of first-degree murder, as well as car theft, evading police, and injuring a police dog during his arrest. The case drew national attention, not just because of who he had been, but because of how preventable it all seemed. Family members, mental health advocates, and even sports analysts began debating what went wrong. In interviews, friends described Brandon as quiet but talented, a kid who had worked hard to get to the pros. They remembered how proud his father had been when he signed his first contract. One friend said that Brandon's relationship with his father had become strained after baseball ended. Without the game, he lost purpose. His father tried to guide him toward new goals, but Brandon rejected every suggestion. He was angry, suspicious, and convinced that his family had turned against him. In Corona, a small memorial began to form outside the Martin home. Neighbors left flowers, photos, and baseballs with handwritten messages. Many of them couldn't believe that someone they'd watched grow up could commit such violence. The story had layers that made it hard to process. A young athlete with everything ahead of him, a supportive father, a trusted uncle, and an innocent technician who had simply been doing his job. The days turned into weeks, and the investigation deepened. Detectives interviewed doctors, coaches, teammates, and relatives. The picture that emerged was of a young man caught between pressure and paranoia. One psychiatrist who had treated him described him as a person struggling to hold on to reality. His condition, untreated for long periods, had left him unpredictable and volatile. Still, prosecutors weren't framing this as a case of pure insanity. They believed Brandon knew exactly what he was doing. He'd targeted specific people, used a weapon he knew well, and fled the scene in a calculated way. The prosecution's view was that this wasn't a random outburst. It was deliberate violence. The defense began preparing for a long battle. They focused on his mental illness, claiming that Brandon's deteriorating mind had made him incapable of understanding his actions. They gathered psychiatric records and planned to show that he had been failed by the system, released too early, untreated, and unmedicated. Meanwhile, the victims' families grieved in silence. Michael's friends remembered him as a gentle man who'd spent his life supporting others. Ricky's relatives said he was always the one trying to keep peace in the family, often stepping in to calm arguments. Barry Swanson's co-workers at ADT described him as dependable and kind. He had been working overtime that week, taking extra shifts to help his team. His death hit his company hard. They held a memorial service in his honor. In early hearings, Brandon appeared in court quiet and detached. He rarely looked up and spoke only in short answers when addressed by the judge. His attorneys entered a plea of not guilty. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, asking if he'd shown any remorse. Prosecutors said he hadn't. Forensic specialists testified about the evidence found at the scene: the fingerprints, the blood spatter, the bat engraved with his name, and the stolen truck. There was little question about who had committed the murders. The question would be why, and whether he had understood what he was doing when he did it. By late 2016, the case was moving slowly through pretrial motions. The defense requested multiple psychiatric evaluations, while prosecutors pushed for the death penalty. The court granted the defense more time to review evidence. As months turned into years, Brandon remained in jail, isolated and under close supervision. Public interest in the case remained high. Local news followed every court date, often replaying clips of his early baseball highlights, a reminder of what he once was. Commentators spoke about how the pressures of professional sports can amplify underlying mental health problems. Others argued that the legal system had failed both Brandon and his victims by releasing him so quickly after the psychiatric hold. For the people of Corona, the story had already changed the way they thought about mental illness and violence. It was no longer a distant topic. It had come from one of their own neighborhoods. The house on Winthrop Drive eventually went quiet, its windows boarded, its driveway empty. But for everyone who had known the Martin family, the echoes of that night lingered. By the time the trial date was finally set, years had passed since the murders. Brandon Martin's name no longer stood for athletic promise. It had become a symbol of loss, failure, and unanswered questions. What had gone so wrong inside his mind? Could anyone have stopped it? Those questions hung heavy as the courtroom prepared to revisit the night of September 17, 2015. The night a burst of rage, and a moment of madness tore 3 lives apart. By the time Brandon Martin's trial began in 2020, 5 years had passed since the night that ended 3 lives and destroyed his own. The delay had come from legal motions, psychiatric evaluations, and the slow grind of the justice system. The courtroom in Riverside County filled with quiet tension each day as prosecutors, defense attorneys, and family members sat only a few feet apart. Brandon, now in his late 20s, entered wearing a standard jail uniform. His once athletic build had faded, and his face showed little emotion. The same calm that had frightened police the night he was arrested now filled the courtroom. The prosecution's case was direct and methodical. They presented the story as one of calculated rage, not mental confusion. Using photos, police reports, and autopsy findings, they showed how Brandon had attacked 3 unarmed men with a baseball bat engraved with his name. They reminded the jury that the victims included his own father, Michael Martin, 64, his uncle, Ricky Lee Anderson, 58, and Barry Swanson, 62, the ADT technician who had no connection to the family other than being there to install a security system. The state argued that Brandon knew what he was doing that evening, that he chose to act out of anger after being released from psychiatric care only 2 days earlier. Witness after witness described the hours before the killings. Officers testified about the September 15th mental health hold, explaining that Brandon had been taken to the facility after threatening his parents. Doctors confirmed that he was released after a short evaluation. The prosecutor told the jury that when Brandon returned home, his parents immediately called for a security system because they feared for their safety. 2 days later, that same installer became one of the victims. Forensic specialists explained the physical evidence. The bat had traces of blood from all 3 victims and carried Brandon's fingerprints. Blood patterns showed he struck each man multiple times. The truck he stole after the killings had Barry Swanson's blood on the steering wheel and Michael Martin's on the driver's door. The prosecutor played a recording of the 911 call made by Brandon's cousin, the first to discover the bodies. The room fell silent as the sound of panic filled the air. The defense told a different story. They didn't deny that Brandon had killed the men, but argued that he was legally insane when he did it. His lawyers described a long history of mental illness, including paranoid schizophrenia and psychotic episodes that had begun years before his baseball career ended. They said he heard voices, believed his family was plotting against him, and felt constantly watched. His attorney explained that Brandon had not been taking medication and that the health system had failed him by releasing him too soon. Psychiatrists for the defense testified that Brandon's mind was fractured and that he was unable to distinguish reality from delusion. They said the killings were not premeditated acts of hate, but the result of a complete break from reality. The prosecution countered that he had shown control and awareness. He used a weapon, fled the scene, stole a truck, and tried to hide. That, they said, showed intent. Family members of the victims attended every hearing. Kathy Martin, Brandon's mother, sat through the testimony with her head bowed most of the time. She had lost her husband and brother to her own son's violence, and now faced the task of hearing it all retold in detail. When the court played photographs from the scene, she quietly left the room, unable to stay. After weeks of testimony, both sides made their closing arguments. The prosecution told the jury that this was a man who knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. The defense said he was a deeply sick man who never got the help he needed. When the case went to the jury, it took only a few hours for them to reach a verdict. On November 4, 2020, the jury found Brandon Martin guilty on all counts: 3 murders, auto theft, evading arrest, and injuring a police dog. They also found true the special circumstance of multiple murders, making him eligible for the death penalty. In the penalty phase that followed, the jury listened to more testimony about his life, his decline, and the pain of those he had left behind. Prosecutors asked for death, arguing that the brutality of the crime warranted the maximum sentence. The defense asked for mercy, citing his mental illness and lack of criminal history. In January 2021, the jury reached its decision. Brandon Martin would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge accepted the recommendation, telling him that his actions had destroyed not only 3 lives, but an entire family. Brandon showed little reaction. He simply nodded, eyes unfocused, as the verdict was read. Outside the courthouse, relatives of the victims spoke briefly to reporters. They said there was no sense of victory, only relief that the trial was finally over. Michael and Ricky's family members said they hoped people would remember the victims as kind men who cared deeply for others. Barry Swanson's co-workers from ADT said they would never forget a friend who died while simply doing his job. Brandon was transferred to a state prison facility soon after sentencing. He remains there today, serving his life term. The house on Winthrop Drive was eventually sold, though locals say it still carries the weight of what happened there. Neighbors who lived through that night never forgot the flashing lights or the helicopters circling overhead. The story of Brandon Martin is one of wasted potential and warning. A first-round draft pick with a bright future became a symbol of how fragile the line between promise and tragedy can be. It's a story about family, untreated illness, and the desperate need for intervention that never came. In the end, it's also about accountability, the law stepping in where help had failed. As the courtroom emptied and the cameras faded, the final image left behind was that of a young man once destined for fame, now facing a lifetime behind bars. The bat that once represented his dream became the weapon that ended it. The tragedy of Corona, California, will always carry his name, but not for the reasons anyone ever expected. In October 2020, a former Major League Baseball pitcher and a beloved Scottsdale bar owner crossed paths for the last time. What began as love ended in a chilling act of violence. Behind the headlines lay secrets, fear, and a descent into darkness that no one saw coming, until it was too late. In October 2020, the city of Scottsdale, Arizona, became the center of a disturbing story that blended love, heartbreak, and tragedy. It involved 2 people who, on the surface, seemed to be moving through life in different but hopeful directions. One was Charles "Charlie" Hager, a 37-year-old former professional baseball pitcher who once stood on major league mounds. The other was Danielle Breed, a 34-year-old business owner who ran a lively neighborhood bar. Their lives intersected in what started as a romantic relationship but ended in violence that no one close to them could have predicted. Charlie Hager had lived a life that many young athletes dream of. Born and raised in Michigan, he had built his identity around baseball. He was known for throwing a knuckleball, one of the most unpredictable pitches in the sport. It got him noticed and eventually led him to the major leagues, where he played for teams like the Chicago White Sox, San Diego Padres, and Los Angeles Dodgers. His career was not marked by fame or records, but he was respected for his discipline and persistence. However, after his final season in 2010, his time in the spotlight faded. Retirement hit him hard. He tried coaching and even gave motivational talks, but something in his personal life seemed unsettled. Those who knew him described him as a man searching for direction, someone who struggled to adjust to life outside of baseball. Danielle Breed, whose full name was Danielle Breed Garth, had a different path. She was a well-known figure in Scottsdale's social scene, co-owning the Tipsy Coyote Bar and Grill, a lively spot popular among locals for its welcoming energy. She was described as driven, cheerful, and deeply involved in her business. Her friends and family said she had a natural ability to connect with people and make them feel comfortable. She worked hard to build her reputation as a young entrepreneur in her early 30s. To the outside world, Danielle's life appeared stable and full of promise, but behind that success, she was dealing with the emotional strain of a relationship that had turned dark. Danielle and Charlie began dating sometime after his baseball career ended. At first, they seemed happy. He was charming, and she was understanding, often supporting him through his career struggles. But as time passed, cracks began to show. Hager's insecurities and anger started to surface. The once loving relationship shifted toward control and tension. Friends later recalled that Danielle had grown distant and uneasy. She started confiding in people close to her that she didn't feel safe anymore. According to her mother, Danielle had recently been planning to file a restraining order against Hager, a sign that things had deteriorated to a dangerous level. Scottsdale, with its calm neighborhoods and desert backdrop, wasn't the kind of place where anyone expected tragedy. But by the fall of 2020, their story had reached its breaking point. On October 2nd, events unfolded that would end in a violent and irreversible act. That evening, Danielle was at her home on East Thomas Road. Living with her at the time was a male roommate, a friend who also helped her around the house. It was a normal day until Hager showed up. Reports later revealed that he entered the home with a gun in hand. The roommate heard shouting from Danielle's bedroom and rushed toward the noise. What he saw next would haunt him forever. According to the police statement, the roommate saw Charlie Hager standing in the hallway with a handgun moments after a gunshot was fired. Danielle screamed, and before the roommate could do anything, Hager turned the gun toward him. The roommate managed to escape and fled out of the house, running for his life. He immediately called 911 to report the shooting. When officers arrived at the scene, they found Danielle Breed dead in her bedroom. She had been shot, and Hager was nowhere to be found. Scottsdale police quickly launched a manhunt. Word of the incident spread fast, especially after the victim's identity became public. The idea that a former Major League athlete could be involved in such a brutal crime sent shockwaves through both the sports world and the local community. Investigators began piecing together the events leading up to the shooting. They discovered that Danielle had been living in fear of Hager for some time. Friends said she had made multiple comments about wanting to protect herself. There were also reports that Hager had been struggling with personal issues, including depression and financial problems. Those close to him mentioned that he had been unstable in recent months, sometimes appearing angry and paranoid. The relationship had reached a point where Danielle wanted distance, but Hager couldn't accept it. By the next morning, law enforcement across Arizona was on high alert. They tracked Hager's cell phone and issued a "be on the lookout" alert for his car, a gray 2020 Chrysler. The story made local news headlines within hours, with reporters camped outside the crime scene. Scottsdale police urged the public not to approach Hager if spotted, describing him as armed and dangerous. Meanwhile, family members of both Danielle and Charlie were in shock. Danielle's loved ones gathered near her bar, laying flowers and sharing memories of her warmth and kindness. Her mother told local reporters that Danielle had been planning to start a new chapter in her life. She said her daughter had loved deeply, but had finally decided to walk away from a man who had become volatile. For Charlie's family, the situation was equally painful. They couldn't reconcile the man they knew, a former athlete with discipline and ambition, with a violent suspect police were now searching for. Hager's background in baseball gave the case an added layer of public attention. News outlets revisited his career highlights, showing footage from his days with the Dodgers and interviews from when he was still pitching. Many former teammates expressed disbelief. To them, Hager had always been polite, focused, even quiet. No one could have imagined he would one day be accused of murder. As the search continued, detectives began connecting more clues. Security cameras from nearby areas captured a vehicle matching Hager's car driving north, away from Scottsdale. It became clear that he had fled immediately after the shooting. Authorities coordinated with the Coconino County Sheriff's Office near the Grand Canyon, suspecting that Hager might head toward northern Arizona, where he was known to hike and camp. By October 3rd, less than 24 hours after the murder, officers found Hager's car abandoned near the south rim of the Grand Canyon. They searched the area on foot and by helicopter. The terrain was rough and heavily wooded, making the search difficult. Later that afternoon, they discovered a man's body along a trail not far from a parked car. It was identified as Charlie Hager. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The discovery confirmed what police had suspected, a murder-suicide. The case officially came to a close within a single day, but the shockwaves continued. Danielle's friends were heartbroken, unable to make sense of how a loving relationship had turned into such horror. Scottsdale's residents, used to quiet desert evenings and safe neighborhoods, were left shaken. The murder of Danielle Breed left the Scottsdale community reeling. For those who knew her, it was not just a crime. It was an unbearable loss that felt senseless. As police and reporters pieced together what happened, a clearer picture began to emerge of the days and weeks leading up to the tragedy. The warning signs, the emotional tension, and the unraveling of Charlie Hager's state of mind. What began as a relationship between two adults who once cared for each other had turned into a cycle of fear and volatility that neither escaped from alive. In the aftermath of the shooting, Scottsdale Police Department detectives began gathering statements, collecting evidence, and reviewing the timeline. The roommate who witnessed part of the crime provided critical information. His quick thinking and ability to escape had saved his life and given investigators the first account of what occurred inside the house that night. He described hearing Danielle scream, followed by a gunshot, and then seeing Hager come out of her bedroom holding a pistol. The roommate said that Hager looked calm but focused, a detail that haunted him. When Hager pointed the gun toward him, he bolted out the front door and ran to safety, dialing 911 as soon as he was clear. The 911 call came in around 6 p.m. Officers arrived at the residence minutes later, but it was too late. Danielle was found dead in her bedroom with a fatal gunshot wound. Detectives secured the scene and began canvassing the neighborhood. Neighbors told police they had heard shouting earlier in the evening, but thought it was a normal argument. One neighbor said they saw a gray sedan leaving quickly around the time of the shooting. That detail matched Hager's vehicle. While investigators worked at the crime scene, Hager was already on the move. Based on phone tracking records later reviewed, he had driven north toward Flagstaff, then continued toward the Grand Canyon. Police issued a statewide alert that night, identifying him as armed and dangerous. At the same time, Danielle's family learned what had happened. Her mother, Jane Garth, later said that when she got the call, she already feared the worst. Danielle had told her days earlier that she was preparing to file a restraining order against Hager because she feared he might snap. Friends and co-workers of Danielle's confirmed that she had been trying to move on from the relationship for months. She had thrown herself into her work, spending most of her time at the Tipsy Coyote Bar and Grill. Her employees described her as upbeat and focused, but in private moments, she admitted to feeling anxious about Hager. A close friend recalled that Danielle often said she wished he would just let go. She didn't want him hurt, but she wanted space, something that, in the end, he refused to give. For detectives, the next day was a race against time. With Hager's car spotted heading toward the northern desert, multiple law enforcement agencies joined the search. The Coconino County Sheriff's Office, the National Park Service, and Arizona Department of Public Safety coordinated their efforts. Helicopters scanned trails near the Grand Canyon south rim. By afternoon, park rangers located the gray Chrysler parked near a trailhead. Not far away, they found Hager's body. He had shot himself with the same handgun believed to have been used to kill Danielle. The discovery confirmed the worst, a murder-suicide motivated by rage and desperation. Back in Scottsdale, the story dominated local headlines. It wasn't just another case of domestic violence. It involved a former professional athlete whose life had spiraled from success to tragedy. Reporters quickly dug into Hager's background, tracing his path from his early baseball career to the years following his retirement. Born in Livonia, Michigan, he had shown promise from a young age. His mastery of the knuckleball earned him respect and admiration. But after a few inconsistent seasons and several injuries, his major league career faded. By the time he turned 30, he was struggling to find purpose. Friends from his baseball days said Hager was a quiet but intense person. He often spoke about feeling lost after the game ended. Baseball had been his structure, his identity, and without it he seemed adrift. Some teammates described him as a man who could be kind one day and withdrawn the next. After leaving the league, he took on coaching roles and even ran a baseball training business for young players. But financial instability and the emotional weight of his failures began to take a toll. When he met Danielle, she seemed to bring light into his life again. She admired his past accomplishments, and he admired her independence. But their personalities clashed. Danielle was outgoing, social, and comfortable in her success. Charlie was introspective and struggling. What started as admiration turned into control. Friends said Hager's jealousy grew as Danielle became more independent. He started questioning who she talked to, where she went, and how she ran her business. At first, Danielle brushed it off, but over time, the behavior worsened. Family members recalled that by the summer of 2020, Danielle had started pulling away from him. She didn't want to make a scene or involve police at first. She hoped he would eventually accept that the relationship was over. But Hager didn't take it well. In late September, just days before her death, she confided to her mother that she planned to go to court to get legal protection. She told her mom, "I'm afraid of what he might do." That same week, she mentioned to a friend that Hager had been trying to contact her repeatedly. Police investigators later reviewed text messages and calls between them in the days leading up to the murder. The tone showed a man who couldn't accept rejection. Hager had sent messages suggesting that he wanted to talk and make things right. Danielle didn't respond to most of them. She wanted to move on peacefully, but he saw her silence as rejection. That emotional tension likely reached a breaking point on October 2nd. For many who followed the case, the most unsettling aspect was how fast everything escalated. There were no public fights, no previous police reports of violence, and no signs of a clear plan. Yet, behind the scenes, the emotional storm had been building. It was the kind of situation that often stays invisible until it explodes. After the discovery of Hager's body, police held a press briefing. The Scottsdale Police Department confirmed the case as a murder-suicide. They released limited details, but expressed condolences to both families. The department emphasized the tragedy as a reminder of how domestic violence can happen anywhere, even among people who appear stable and successful. News outlets across the country picked up the story. ESPN and major sports networks covered Hager's death, with headlines calling it a shocking fall from grace. The Los Angeles Dodgers, one of his former teams, issued a statement saying they were deeply saddened by the loss of life and offered sympathy to the families involved. But beyond the sports coverage, the focus returned to Danielle, a young woman remembered for her kindness, her entrepreneurial spirit, and her dreams that were cut short. Her funeral took place days later, attended by friends, family, and members of the local business community. Mourners described her as generous and full of energy, someone who loved people and made others feel welcome. The Tipsy Coyote Bar and Grill, which she had co-owned, temporarily closed to honor her memory. Messages of support poured in from customers who shared stories of her laughter and warmth. Her mother spoke during the service, saying that Danielle had the biggest heart and the brightest smile, and that she hoped her daughter's death would remind others to take threats and fear seriously before it's too late. Meanwhile, those who had known Hager in his baseball days struggled to process what happened. A former coach said that Hager's mental health had declined over the years and that he might not have had the right support system after his career ended. Several of his old teammates publicly shared their sadness, not to excuse what he did, but to acknowledge how deeply he had changed. They remembered a man who was once cheerful and disciplined, now consumed by jealousy and depression. The story of Charlie Hager and Danielle Breed quickly became one of those cautionary tales, not just about fame and downfall, but about emotional instability and the dangers of possessiveness disguised as love. It showed how obsession can build quietly, how control can replace care, and how one person's inability to let go can destroy two lives and leave families broken. In the weeks following the murder, the Scottsdale Police Department continued to gather evidence and finalize reports. Though there would be no trial, since Hager had taken his own life, detectives wanted to complete their investigation for the family's sake. They verified ballistic evidence linking Hager's gun to both deaths, confirmed the timeline through phone records, and ruled the case officially closed. For the community, the pain lingered. Scottsdale was a city known for peace and safety, but the murder left a lasting scar. At Danielle's bar, her friends and coworkers created a small memorial with candles and photographs. Many people who had never met her stopped by to leave flowers. It was a reminder that her life, though tragically cut short, had touched many others. In the days that followed the deaths of Charlie Hager and Danielle Breed, the shock gave way to grief and reflection. The Scottsdale Police Department wrapped up their investigation quickly, confirming what many had already suspected. The case was a murder-suicide. The evidence left little doubt. The handgun found near Hager's body in the Grand Canyon matched the one used to kill Danielle. Ballistics, phone records, and witness testimony from the roommate all aligned to form a clear timeline of events. The crime had been personal, deliberate, and final. But even as the facts settled, the emotions surrounding the tragedy were far from resolved. Hager's death meant there would never be a trial, no courtroom testimony, no cross-examination, and no public confession. The police report stood in place of any formal justice. Detectives wrote that Hager had driven from Scottsdale to the Grand Canyon immediately after the shooting, parking his car near a remote trail before taking his own life with the same weapon. In the vehicle, investigators found a few personal items, a wallet, some cash, and his cell phone. There was no note, no written explanation. What remained were unanswered questions about what had pushed him beyond reason. For Danielle's family, those unanswered questions were painful, but secondary to their loss. They wanted people to remember her for who she was, not just how she died. Her mother, Jane, became an advocate for domestic violence awareness soon after the tragedy. She spoke to local media, urging women to act early if they felt unsafe. In one interview, she said, "If you feel fear, you can't ignore it. My daughter thought she could handle it quietly, but fear isn't something you should face alone." That message resonated deeply in the community, especially among young women who had followed Danielle's story in the news. Meanwhile, the sports world continued to process the disturbing reality of what one of its former players had done. Charlie Hager's name had once appeared on the rosters of respected teams, the Dodgers, White Sox, and Padres, but now it was tied to one of the darkest headlines in recent baseball memory. Former teammates spoke out, describing their disbelief. Many said they hadn't spoken to him in years and had no idea he was struggling so badly. A few mentioned that he'd seemed troubled in the past, that he'd been trying to find stability after retiring. His post-baseball life had been marked by short-lived coaching jobs, failed business ventures, and personal isolation. Those who knew him best admitted that, while he had been hardworking, he also carried emotional volatility that sometimes surfaced under stress. The media coverage gradually shifted from the sensational details of the murder to the underlying issues behind it. Experts discussed how athletes often face identity crises after their careers end. Without structure, fame, or purpose, some spiral into depression or anger. But while that might help explain Hager's unraveling, it didn't excuse his actions. Police reports made it clear that the killing of Danielle Breed was a calculated act of control and revenge, not an accident born of despair. It was the final expression of a man who couldn't accept the end of a relationship. Danielle's bar, the Tipsy Coyote, became a symbol of remembrance. Her co-owners reopened it weeks later, keeping her photo displayed near the entrance. Customers shared stories about her generosity, how she'd buy drinks for regulars having a bad day or stay late to help staff clean up after hours. To them, she was not a statistic, but a friend whose presence had brightened the room. The bar hosted a fundraiser in her name, with proceeds going to a local domestic violence shelter. It was their way of turning grief into something meaningful. The Scottsdale community also responded with quiet strength. Vigils were held, candles were lit, and posters with messages like "Justice for Danielle" and "End Relationship Violence" appeared around the city. While there would never be a conviction or sentencing, people sought justice through awareness. The story sparked renewed conversations about restraining orders and the importance of taking threats seriously. Police emphasized that help was available to those who felt unsafe in relationships, and local organizations saw a noticeable increase in calls for assistance after the case. The emotional aftermath was complicated for Hager's family, too. They issued a brief statement expressing sorrow for Danielle's death and for their son's actions, acknowledging that nothing could make up for what he'd done. Friends of the Hager family described them as heartbroken and bewildered, saying they were mourning both the loss of their child and the irreversible harm he had caused. For them, there was no sense of closure, only disbelief and regret. In a broader sense, the case became an example of how unchecked emotions can destroy lives. It was a story of love turned toxic, of obsession disguised as devotion. Danielle had wanted freedom. Charlie had wanted control. When she tried to step away, he saw it as betrayal. That inability to let go, combined with emotional instability and access to a weapon, ended in tragedy. The police investigation concluded with no loose ends, but emotionally, the story left an open wound in everyone it touched. By the time the official case file was closed, the story had already become part of Arizona's local history, a reminder of how easily relationships can turn dangerous when fear replaces trust. Danielle's mother continued to speak publicly in the years that followed, keeping her daughter's memory alive. She worked with advocacy groups, sharing Danielle's story to educate others about warning signs of abuse. Her efforts helped turn one family's nightmare into a message of prevention and awareness. As months passed, the media moved on to other stories, but for those who knew Danielle and Charlie, the tragedy never faded. Friends of Danielle continued to visit her grave, leaving flowers and notes. Some of Hager's old teammates visited his hometown in Michigan, where he was quietly laid to rest by his family. Both lives ended far from where they began, two people connected by love, destroyed by its shadow. In the end, there was no courtroom confession, no sentencing, no redemption. Only a quiet trail near the Grand Canyon where a former athlete ended his life, and a home in Scottsdale where a young woman lost hers. The case of Charlie Hager and Danielle Breed remains a haunting story, not just of crime, but of how human emotion, when left unchecked, can turn fatal. It stands as a reminder that behind every tragedy like this, there are warnings, fears, and choices that could have changed everything. The tragedy closed with 2 funerals, 2 grieving families, and a community trying to find meaning in heartbreak. Danielle's story continues to echo through Scottsdale, a story of love, fear, and the cost of silence, while Charlie's name lives on as a cautionary tale of what happens when obsession replaces understanding and control becomes stronger than compassion. In the quiet that followed, the city was left to remember both lives, their mistakes, their pain, and the irreversible choices that turned a troubled relationship into one of Arizona's most devastating true crimes.